The moment Eliza Calloway stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the blazing summer of 1878, she dropped every single one of her bags, and not a single soul in that rowdy, sun-scorched town moved to help her, except for one man who had no reason to do so and did it anyway. She had not expected the town to be so loud. The stagecoach had rattled her bones for 2 days straight from San Antonio, and the dust that rose in great amber clouds from the unpaved Main Street coated her dark green traveling dress in a film of grit she suspected would never entirely wash out. The smell of horses and leather and wood smoke hit her all at once, mingled with the sharp tang of something fried coming from the saloon across the street. Dusty Creek was exactly the kind of town her mother had warned her about when she had boarded the train in Cincinnati 3 weeks prior, raw, loud, unapologetic, and absolutely indifferent to the sensibilities of a 23-year-old schoolteacher who had never been west of the Mississippi, until grief and necessity had conspired to drag her there. She had come because of her uncle, Gerald Calloway, who had written her a letter the previous autumn describing in enthusiastic, if barely legible cursive his new schoolhouse on the edge of town, and his desperate need for someone who could teach the children of Dusty Creek how to read without accidentally setting the building on fire, which, he had noted, the previous teacher had managed to do twice. Gerald had passed away in March from a fever before she could arrive, and now she was here because she had already sold most of her belongings in Cincinnati, had given up her position at the girls' academy, and had nowhere else to go. The schoolhouse was hers in the deed her uncle had left her, and she had decided that belonging somewhere, even if she had never seen it, was better than belonging nowhere at all. The driver had deposited her 3 large bags unceremoniously onto the dirt beside the coach and driven on before she could even ask him if there was a boarding house nearby. She stood there with her hat slightly crooked, her boots already filmed with dust, and she looked at the bags with the particular expression of a woman who has just realized that life has placed her in a situation she did not fully plan for. She could manage 2 of the bags easily enough. Third, a large canvas trunk packed with textbooks and teaching supplies that weighed somewhere close to 50 pounds, was another matter entirely. She was still calculating her options when she heard boots on the packed dirt behind her, steady and unhurried, and then without a word, without so much as clearing his throat to announce himself, the man reached down and picked up the heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing at all, tucking it under one arm while he reached for the second large bag with his free hand. She turned and looked at him. He was tall, considerably taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that strained slightly against a faded blue work shirt rolled to the elbows. He wore a battered brown hat that had clearly seen years of hard use, and beneath its brim she could see dark hair that curled slightly at his temples from the heat. His jaw was strong and shadowed with a few days of growth, and his eyes, when he glanced briefly at her before starting to walk, were the color of dark amber brown with flecks of gold, steady and quiet in a way that felt almost startling in the noisy chaos of the Main Street. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she guessed, though there was something in the set of his expression that made him seem both younger and older than that simultaneously, like a man who had once known how to laugh freely and was slowly remembering. "I can manage," she said, which was not entirely true but felt like the right thing to say. "I know you can," he said, and kept walking. She blinked. Then she picked up her remaining small bag and followed him because really, what else was she going to do? His name was Cole Merritt, and he had been in Dusty Creek for 3 years, which in that town made him practically a founding member. He ran a small cattle operation about 4 miles east of town on land he had bought with the last of his savings after leaving the Rangers, a decision he had made quietly and without fanfare the way he made most of his decisions, which was to say without telling anyone much about it. He had a small house, a proper house, not a bunkhouse, that he had built with his own hands over 2 winters, a good horse named Beauregard, a barn that leaked in 2 places he kept meaning to fix, and a reputation in town as a man who was reliable, decent, and not particularly given to conversation. He had been at the general store picking up a sack of flour and a new length of rope when he had seen the stagecoach stop, and watched the woman tumble out with more luggage than a person her size should reasonably have been carrying. He had watched the men on the porch of the saloon do absolutely nothing. He had watched old Chester Doyle pretend to be deeply absorbed in tying his horse to the post. He had watched, and then he had crossed the street because there was simply no version of himself that could watch a woman struggling with luggage in the dust and keep walking. He had not thought about it beyond that. There was no grand calculation, no expectation of anything in return. It was simply the thing that needed doing, and he was the only one apparently willing to do it. He carried her bags to the front of the boarding house run by a woman named Mee Hutchins, who was the closest thing Dusty Creek had to an institution, set them down on the porch, touched the brim of his hat at the woman in the green dress, and turned to leave. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "You did not tell me your name," she said. He turned back around. "Cole Merritt." "Eliza Calloway," she said. She held out her hand and he shook it briefly, her hand warm and small in his. "Thank you, Mr. Merritt. That was very kind of you." "You are welcome, Miss Calloway," he said, and then he walked back to his horse, untied Beauregard from the post outside the general store, tied the flour sack to the saddle, and rode back toward his land. He did not think about her again until dinner, when he sat alone at his kitchen table eating beans and cornbread, and found himself thinking that he could not remember the last time someone had looked at him the way she had, not with admiration or fear or suspicion, but with genuine, uncomplicated gratitude, as though he had done something worth noticing. It was a small thing. He told himself it was a very small thing. He was wrong. Mee Hutchins was a woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 55 and 100, with iron-gray hair and a sharp tongue she wielded with the precision of a surgeon. She had come west with her late husband in 1859, survived the years of the Civil War on the frontier with a combination of grit and stubbornness that would have impressed a general, and now ran the cleanest boarding house between San Antonio and Abilene with a rod of iron and genuine maternal warmth. She took to Eliza immediately, which was significant because Mee did not take to most people immediately or at all. "You are Gerald Calloway's niece," Mee said, setting down a plate of supper that first evening. It was not a question. "I am," Eliza said. "Did you know him?" "Know him?" Mee snorted with what was, Eliza realized, genuine affection. "Gerald Calloway taught my youngest boy to read 3 years after any sensible person had given up on him. Yes, I knew him. He was a ridiculous, wonderful man who ate too little and cared too much, and the fever took him before the town gave him the appreciation he deserved." She sat down across from Eliza without being asked, which appeared to be simply her way. "So you are here to take over his school?" "I am trying to be," Eliza said. "I need to see what condition the building is in first." "It is in better condition than most things around here," Mee said. "Cole Merritt repaired the roof in April. He does things like that, fixes things without making a production of it." Eliza looked up from her plate. "Cole Merritt." Mee's eyes sharpened with the particular focus of a woman who misses absolutely nothing. "He carried your bags this afternoon, I saw from the window." "He did," Eliza said, "without being asked." "That is Cole," Mee said simply. She was quiet for a moment, spooning gravy. "That boy has carried a great deal in his life. Carrying bags for a stranger is probably the easiest thing he has done all year." Eliza wanted to ask what she meant by that, but something in Mee's tone suggested the comment was not an invitation to inquiry, and so she filed it away in the back of her mind where she kept things she did not yet understand but suspected she would eventually need to. She slept deeply that first night, exhausted from travel, in a room that smelled of cedar and clean linen, and in the morning she put on her second-best dress and walked to the schoolhouse. It was a good building. Sturdy, solid, with good windows and enough space for perhaps 30 children. The roof, as Mee had indicated, was sound. Someone had also replaced two of the porch boards recently and repaired a hinge on the front door that had clearly been damaged. There was a small blackboard at the front of the room, chalky and waiting, and rows of rough wooden desks that were worn smooth by years of small hands. Eliza stood in the center of the room and felt, for the first time since leaving Cincinnati, that she might actually be able to do this. She spent the morning cleaning and organizing, making a list of supplies she would need and another list of things she wanted to know about the town and its families. By noon, she was covered in chalk dust and the kind of satisfied tiredness that comes from useful work. She went to the general store to purchase a few cleaning supplies and was introduced to the owner, a round-faced man named Hector Vance, who had the chatty disposition of a person who had been somewhat starved for interesting conversation. Hector told her that there were approximately 40 children in Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches who were of schooling age, that the previous teacher had been a man named Pratt who had possessed neither patience nor common sense in sufficient quantities, that the town council had been debating whether to hire another teacher for 6 months, and that Gerald Calloway had held the whole project together by force of personality right up until he got sick. "And who is on the town council?" Eliza asked, writing things in the small notebook she carried. "Mayor Thomas Briggs, you will meet him, he will come to you, he comes to everyone eventually, Sheriff Jim Walcott, who is a decent man despite appearing to be made of leather and disappointment, and 3 ranchers, one of whom is Cole Merritt." Hector paused. "Though Cole does not say much in the meetings, he just votes sensibly." "I seem to keep hearing that name," Eliza said. "That is because Cole Merritt is the kind of man a town like this runs on," Hector said, with the particular certainty of someone who had thought about this before. "He does not make speeches. He just does things, fixes the school roof, pulls someone's cattle out of a flood, rides out to check on the Dawson family when the father gets sick. You barely notice him doing it until it is done." Eliza bought her supplies, walked back to the schoolhouse, and thought about a man who did things without being asked, without announcement, without apparent expectation of recognition. She found the image compelling and slightly melancholy, in a way she could not quite articulate to herself. The following Sunday, the whole town came to church in the way that Western towns came to church, not entirely out of devotion, but because it was the 1 hour of the week when everyone was in the same room and news got distributed efficiently alongside Scripture. Eliza sat beside me and was introduced to more people than she could reasonably keep track of. The Dawson family with their 6 children, the Henley sisters who ran the dressmaker's shop, the Ray's family whose ranch was the largest operation in the county, Doc Ambrose who was considerably more cheerful than his profession tended to encourage, and a dozen others whose names she wrote in her notebook later. Cole Merritt sat 3 rows back on the right side. She noticed him because he was still, in the way that certain people are still, not rigid, not tense, but genuinely calm, as though the noise and the shuffling of the world around him simply did not reach him the same way it reached everyone else. He wore a clean shirt, and his hat was in his hands, and he stared at a point somewhere in the middle distance during the hymns in a way that suggested he was listening to something other than the music. He caught her looking. His expression did not change dramatically, just a slight shift, a flicker of acknowledgement, and he nodded once. She nodded back and returned her attention to Reverend Clark's sermon, which was something about responsibility and community, and which she found, under the circumstances, rather pointed. After the service, she was standing on the church steps talking to the Dawson family about their children's reading levels when Cole appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision, speaking quietly with the sheriff. He looked, from this angle, very much like a man who was comfortable being on the periphery of things, not excluded, not unwelcome, just not particularly seeking the center. She excused herself from the Dawsons and crossed toward him before she had entirely decided to do so, which surprised her a little. "Mr. Merritt," she said. He looked at her with that same quiet attention, Up close in daylight, his eyes were even warmer than she had remembered, that deep amber brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Miss Calloway, how are you settling in?" "Reasonably well," she said. "Me is very good company. The school is in excellent condition, which I understand I have you to partly thank for." Something shifted in his expression, not discomfort exactly, but the particular look of a person who is unaccustomed to being thanked. "I just repaired the roof," he said. "It needed doing." "It did not need to be done by you specifically," she said. "You chose to do it." He seemed to consider this. "Yes," he said finally, as though he had never quite thought about it that way. "I am opening the school on Monday," she said. "I would very much appreciate it if you spread the word among any families you know on the outlying ranches. Hector Vance told me you are on the town council." "I am," he said. "I will make sure the word gets out." He paused. "Your uncle was a good man, Miss Calloway. The children here were lucky to have him." "I know," she said, and felt the grief move through her the way it did sometimes, quietly, like a tide that had learned not to crash. "I am hoping to be half as good." "From what I hear, you come well recommended," he said. She blinked. "What do you hear? I have been in town 4 days." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the outline of one, like the sketch before the painting. "Me talks," he said. "And Hector Vance has been telling everyone you have a notebook." She laughed, genuinely, and he watched her do it with an expression that was harder to read, something attentive and slightly wondering, as though laughter in close proximity was something he had to actively observe to believe in. "Good day, Mr. Merritt," she said. "Good day, Miss Calloway," he said. She walked back toward Me's boarding house with the afternoon sun warm on her back, and she did not quite understand why the day felt lighter than it had an hour before. Monday arrived with 31 children. Eliza had been prepared for perhaps 20. She had not been prepared for 31, ranging in age from 6 to 14, in various states of academic preparedness, ranging from a 12-year-old named Anna Reyes who read fluently and did sums in her head with suspicious ease, to a 7-year-old named Clem Dawson who held his pencil like a weapon and had never written a complete letter in his life. She adapted. She divided them into 3 groups, assigned the more advanced students to help the younger ones with practice drills while she worked through reading primers with the beginners, and by noon she had established something that resembled order. By afternoon she had established something that resembled genuine enthusiasm, which she counted as a considerable victory. The children were curious about her in the unguarded way of children who have not yet learned that curiosity should be concealed. They asked her where she was from, what Cincinnati looked like, whether she had ever seen a real riverboat, whether she was afraid of snakes, and whether it was true that she had arrived on the stagecoach with more bags than anyone in living memory. She answered all of their questions honestly, including the last one, and this appeared to cement her credibility considerably. At the end of the day, she was locking the schoolhouse door when she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to find Cole Merritt pulling Beauregard to a stop a few yards away. He had a length of wood across his saddle that looked like it had been recently cut. "The step on the left side of your porch is cracked," he said, by way of greeting. "I noticed it last week when I was checking the roof. I brought a replacement board." She looked at the step. He was right, there was a clear crack running diagonally across it that she had been stepping around all day without registering. "You were carrying that board all day," she said. "No," he said. "I cut it this afternoon." It took about 10 minutes. He swung down from Beauregard in one smooth motion, the way a man does when horses and land are so deeply embedded in his daily life that the movement is as natural as breathing. He pulled a small hammer and some nails from his saddlebag and had the board replaced in less time than it had taken her to notice there was a problem. She watched him work. His movements were economical, precise, without wasted effort. He tested the new board with his boot, pronounced it solid, and put the old cracked board into the saddlebag to dispose of later. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "do you fix things for everyone in this town?" He considered the question with the seriousness he appeared to give most things. "Not everyone," he said, "just the things that need fixing." Do you ever ask whether you should fix them first? He looked at her directly then. Not usually. Does it bother you? She thought about it honestly. No, she said. It does not bother me at all. I am just trying to understand you. Something moved across his face, not wariness, not quite, but a kind of careful attention, as though he was deciding how to respond to something he had not anticipated. There is not much to understand, he said. I disagree, she said pleasantly, but I will not push. She smiled. Thank you for the step, Mr. Merritt. The children will appreciate not breaking an ankle on it. He touched his hat brim. Good evening, Miss Calloway. She watched him ride away in the long gold light of the October afternoon, and she found herself thinking that he was the most consistently surprising person she had met since arriving in Dusty Creek. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them knew it yet. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Eliza found deeply satisfying. She taught her 31 students with a dedication that Mee declared, with some admiration, bordered on the evangelical. She argued successfully with Mayor Briggs for a small budget to purchase additional primers and paper. She charmed Hector Vance into donating the use of his store for a community reading event that turned out to be the most attended social occasion Dusty Creek had seen since the previous Christmas dance. And Cole Merritt continued to appear, with the quiet regularity of weather, whenever something needed doing that nobody else had thought to address. He brought additional firewood for the schoolhouse before the first cold snap in November. He replaced a broken shutter on the boarding house that Mee had mentioned exactly once, in passing, while Cole happened to be in earshot. He spoke at the council meeting on Eliza's behalf when Mayor Briggs suggested that the school budget was perhaps too generous, presenting his argument in the measured, economical way he did most things. No flourish. No drama, just the clear and logical case for why educating children was not a luxury but a foundation. Briggs approved the budget. He voted against it at the last 2 meetings, Sheriff Walcott told Eliza afterward, with the expression of a man reporting an unexpected geological event. Cole Merritt said 3 sentences and Briggs changed his vote. What 3 sentences? Eliza asked. He said, a town without an educated generation is a town that will not be here in 30 years. We are asking the children to build a future we are not willing to invest in. That is not leadership, it is cowardice. Walcott shook his head. Briggs went red as a beet, voted yes before Cole had even sat back down. Eliza had not been at the council meeting. Women were not invited, a fact she found predictably infuriating. But she had stood outside the window of the meeting room in the chill November air and heard every word. She had walked home afterward feeling something in her chest that was warm and complicated and not entirely easy to name. She invited Cole to supper at Mee's boarding house a few days later. It was Mee's idea, framed as a dinner for several people in the community, though by the time the evening arrived it was somehow just the 3 of them, Mee's social engineering being, as Eliza was beginning to appreciate, a force of nature. He came in his clean shirt, hat in hand, and sat at the table with the slightly careful posture of a man who was not entirely sure whether he was comfortable being in a warm, domestic space and was trying not to show it. Mee served pot roast and biscuits, and a pie that she set on the table with the air of someone establishing a formal argument, and the conversation flowed in the way that conversation flows when 3 people are genuinely interested in each other's company. Cole talked about the ranch with a quiet enthusiasm that he seemed almost embarrassed by the cattle, the land, the way the light hit the eastern fields in the early morning. He had 150 acres and 18 head of cattle, and a plan, described with careful specificity, to expand slowly and steadily rather than overreach the way he had watched other ranchers do to their eventual ruin. He talked about the land with the same attentiveness he brought to everything, as though it deserved to be taken seriously. "Do you have family nearby?" Eliza asked. The warmth in his expression shifted slightly, like a cloud passing. "No," he said, My parents died when I was young. I have a brother in Colorado, but we do not write often. He said this evenly, without apparent distress, but with a flatness that told her the flatness was intentional, a place that had been smoothed over by long practice. I am sorry, she said. It has been a long time, he said. Some things do not become easier with time, she said. They just become more familiar. He looked at her across the table. It was a look she could not entirely interpret, something between recognition and surprise, as though she had said something that landed differently than expected. Yes, he said. That is exactly right. Me, throughout this exchange, was studying her biscuit with the focused attention of someone who was paying extremely close attention to everything except the biscuit. After supper, Eliza walked Cole to the door. The night was cold and clear, the kind of Texas winter night where the stars are so bright and numerous they look almost aggressive. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the invitation," he said. He put his hat back on and looked up at the stars for a moment with that distant quality he sometimes had, as though he was checking in on something. Then he looked back at her. "Miss Calloway, your uncle was right to want you here. The town needed someone who cares the way you do." She felt the warmth of it move through her entirely. "That is a very generous thing to say." "It is just true," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Eliza." It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to realize it a half-second after he said it. She saw the slight tension in his jaw, but she did not give him the opportunity to apologize. "Good night, Cole," she said. He rode away into the cold dark, and she stood on the porch in the starlight until she could no longer hear Beauregard's hoofbeats, and she thought, oh, I see. This is what is happening." The next few weeks were a kind of joyful torture that Eliza suspected only people who have been unexpectedly surprised by their own feelings truly understand. She had not come to Dusty Creek looking for anything except a purpose and a place to belong. She had certainly not come looking for a man who fixed broken steps and defended school budgets, and said her name in the dark like it was something he had been holding carefully all evening. She threw herself into the school with doubled effort, which her students benefited from enormously. She developed a particular fondness for Clem Dawson, who had graduated from gripping his pencil like a weapon to producing, slowly, and with extreme concentration, the most earnest and lopsided letters she had ever seen, each one a genuine triumph of will over the natural inclination of his hand to do anything but write. She organized a Christmas pageant that the entire town attended, held in the schoolhouse with every lamp and candle they could gather, and the children performed a reading that reduced Mee Hutchins to uncharacteristic tears, which Mee immediately attributed to the cold air. Cole came to the pageant. He sat in the back row, his hat on his knee, and watched the children with an expression of quiet delight that she caught once across the crowded room, a full, unguarded smile that transformed his face so completely that she nearly forgot her cue to signal the children to begin the second reading. Afterward, in the scramble of parents collecting children and me distributing her legendary ginger cookies, she found herself standing beside him near the back wall. "Your students did well," he said. "They worked very hard," she said. Clem Dawson read his lines without a single error. 3 months ago he could not write his own name. The pride in her voice was unambiguous, and he heard it, and the smile came back, not the full one from earlier, but a smaller, warmer version that was in some ways more intimate because it was quieter. "You did that," he said. "He did that," she corrected. "I just showed him where the door was." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something building in his expression. She could feel it. A gathering of something that had been accumulating gradually over weeks and weeks, and she wondered if he was going to say it, whatever it was. Then Clem Dawson ran directly between them at full speed, chasing a cookie that had been thrown by someone across the room, and the moment dissolved into laughter and noise and children, and Cole caught the cookie out of the air as it sailed past him, and handed it solemnly back to Clem, who regarded him with approximately the same reverence, a small person gives to someone who has performed an act of extraordinary competence. Cole lifted the boy up, held him at eye level and said, "Good reading tonight, Clem." Clem beamed so hard his entire face disappeared into the smile. Eliza watched Cole set the boy back down and thought that she was, without any remaining uncertainty, completely and thoroughly in love with this man, and that the realization was equal parts wonderful and terrifying. She did not say anything that evening. She was not sure how to, and she was not entirely sure he felt the same way, though there were moments when she thought, she was almost certain, that she could feel something in the air between them that was not simply goodwill between neighbors. January arrived with a cold that had teeth in it, the kind of Texas cold that catches people who think Texas means warmth completely off guard. Several of the outlying ranch families stopped sending their children to school during the worst weeks because the ride was too dangerous, and Eliza found herself teaching a smaller class in a schoolhouse heated by a wood stove. She had become considerably more skilled at managing than she had been in October. One morning in mid-January, she arrived at the schoolhouse to find that someone had been there before her. The stove was already lit, the wood box beside it stacked full with fresh-cut logs, and the room was warm enough that the children, when they arrived, could take off their coats within 5 minutes, instead of spending the first half-hour of class trying not to shiver. She knew who had done it without asking. She sat at her desk in the warm room and looked at the glowing stove and felt something so full and so specific that she had to press her hands flat on the desk to steady herself. That afternoon, when the children had gone and she was putting on her own coat to walk back to Mies, she heard hoofbeats on the road and looked up to find Cole pulling Beauregard to a stop outside. He had clearly been working. His shirt was dusty and he had a smear of something on his jaw, and he looked, altogether, like a man who had ridden past the schoolhouse on his way back from somewhere and decided to stop. "Was it warm enough?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "Cole, why do you do these things?" He looked at her with a careful expression. "What things?" "The stove, the firewood, the step, the roof, the council meeting." She stepped down from the porch and walked toward him, and Beauregard regarded her with large dark eyes and the dignified patience of a horse who has witnessed many significant human moments. "Why do you do all of these things for me?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. He had a talent for silence that was not evasion but something more considered than that. The silence of a person who waits until he knows what he wants to say before he says it. "Because it needs doing," he said finally. And after another pause, "And because he stopped." "Because you what?" she said softly. He looked at her, that amber gaze, steady and warm and carrying something in it that was more than neighborly. "Because thinking about whether you are warm enough or safe enough is the first thing I have thought about in a very long time that is not just the ranch or the cattle or the next thing on the list of practical concerns," he said. "And I did not know what to do with that, so I did the practical things instead." The honesty of it struck her like a struck match. She had not expected that much truth from a man who spoke so sparingly. "Cole," she said. "I know I am not a man who says things easily," he said. He was looking at her with that expression of careful steadiness, as though he was bracing for something. "I have been on my own for a long time and I have gotten accustomed to it. I'm not sure I know how to." He stopped again. Then, very quietly, "I just know that when you laugh, it feels like the first warm day after winter, and I have been in winter for a very long time." She reached up and put her hand on his where it rested on the saddle horn. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she felt it still completely under her touch. "I have been carrying something since my uncle died," she said. "Something heavy and cold and very quiet, and I did not know I had put it down until just now." She looked up at him. "I think you have been helping me carry it without knowing you were doing it." He looked at her hand on his. Then he looked at her face. Then he swung down from Beauregard with that fluid ease, and he was very close to her, close enough that she could see the exact amber and gold of his eyes in the winter afternoon light. "Eliza," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was an answer to a question he had not yet asked, but they both already knew the answer to. He kissed her very gently, in the cold afternoon air outside the schoolhouse, one hand cupping her face with a tenderness that was somehow not surprising at all, as though he had always been careful with things that mattered, and she was simply one more thing that mattered, and perhaps the most. When they stepped back from each other, she was aware that they were standing in plain view of the main road and that at least one person had ridden past them in the last 30 seconds, and she found she did not particularly mind. "I should take you somewhere proper," he said. "For supper. Not me's dining table," she laughed. "Me will be devastated." "Me will be insufferable about this for the next 20 years, he said, and the full smile was back, warm and real and making his whole face entirely different, open, younger, the ghost of the man he might have been if life had been gentler with him in his early years. "She has been watching us like a hawk since the first week." "I know," Eliza said. "I think she planned the dinner with intention." "She absolutely did," Cole said. "I think she told me she wanted to discuss the schoolhouse budget and then sat me at the table across from you and handed me pot roast." "She is a genius," Eliza said. "She is a force of nature," he agreed. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant on Friday evening, which was the finest dining in Dusty Creek, though that was perhaps not the highest bar. It had real tablecloths and candles and a menu written on a slate board, and the proprietor, a dignified Mexican man named Don Agustin Fuentes, who had come north from San Antonio 30 years prior, and had been feeding cowboys and cattle barons with equal dignity ever since, greeted Cole by name and seated them at a good table by the window. She wore her nicest dress, a deep blue that Mee had insisted on pressing herself with a proprietary air that suggested she considered this entire development her personal victory. Cole had shaved and wore a proper jacket and looked entirely himself in it, not uncomfortable or forced, but quietly at ease, as though he carried himself the same way regardless of what he was wearing. They talked for 3 hours. She learned things about him that filled in the outline she had been building in her mind for months, that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a farmer who died of cholera when Cole was 12, that his mother had followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and hard winters, that he had been taken in by a neighbor family who were decent people but already stretched thin, and had left at 17 to find work on the frontier, that he had ridden with the Texas Rangers for 4 years he described briefly and with careful neutrality, which told her the brevity was intentional and the neutrality was constructed, that he had saved enough to buy his land and had spent 3 years building something of his own, slowly and stubbornly. He asked about Cincinnati, and she told him the truth, that she had loved it and found it suffocating simultaneously, that she had been good at her work at the girls' academy, but felt constrained by the expectations of a city that had very fixed ideas about what a woman of 23 should be doing with her life. That her uncle's letters had sounded like an adventure, and that adventure had frightened and excited her in equal measure. "Are you glad you came?" he asked. She looked at him across the table with the candle between them, and she did not even have to think about it. "Unreservedly," she said. His smile this time was slow and certain, and it reached everything. They began to call on each other with a regularity that the town found immediately and openly delightful. Dusty Creek was a small town, and small towns have strong feelings about romance, particularly when it involves 2 people that the town has collectively decided deserve happiness. Mee was visibly triumphant. Hector Vance mentioned it to essentially everyone who came into the store. Even Sheriff Walcott, who projected an air of leathery indifference toward all human emotion, was overheard telling his deputy that it was about time. Cole took her out to the ranch on a Saturday in late January, and she stood in the yard looking at what he had built. The solid house, the barn, the fence lines running clean across the winter-brown grass, and felt the weight of all the solitary winters it had taken him to build it. "It is beautiful," she said, and meant it not just architecturally but in the deeper sense of something that represents a person's whole self made visible. He showed her the horses, Beauregard and two others, a roan mare and a gray gelding. He showed her the small vegetable garden under its winter covering of straw, already planned for spring. He showed her the eastern field where the light, he had once told her, was different in the early morning, and she stood with him and looked at it and understood exactly what he had meant. The way the low winter sun came across the flat land and turned everything to gold and copper, vast and clean and entirely itself. Inside the house, the first thing she noticed was that it was scrupulously neat and almost entirely impersonal. There were no decorations except for a single small photograph on the mantelpiece, a formal portrait of two people she did not recognize. "My parents," he said before she asked. "It is the only photograph I have of them." She looked at the photograph for a long moment at the two serious faces looking out from it. They had been younger than Cole was now. The woman had his eyes. "She was lovely," Eliza said. "She was," he said quietly. She looked around the clean, spare room, the good furniture, the empty walls, the table set for one, and felt something ache in her chest for the years he had been sitting at that table alone. She had said, on the night he kissed her, that she had been carrying his loneliness without knowing it. She had not meant it quite that literally, but standing in his house, she understood it in a new way. She had arrived in Dusty Creek and simply, through the act of being present and interested and alive, had given him something to think about that was not solitude. He had given her warmth and safety and purpose in return. They had been carrying each other's weight without either of them realizing it had been distributed between them. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said, watching her carefully. "This house needs things in it," she said. "Not things. I mean it needs to feel like a home rather than a camp, like someone lives here who plans to stay." "I do plan to stay," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I mean." She turned to look at him directly. "You have built the walls, you just have not let yourself furnish the inside yet." He was quiet. She could see him processing this with the thoughtful care he brought to anything structural and important. "I have not had anyone to furnish it for," he said, and the honesty of it was so plain and direct that she felt it go straight through her. She crossed the room and took his hand. "Well," she said, "you do now." He looked at her hand in his, then he looked at her face. Then he said, with a quiet certainty that was everything she had come to understand about him, unhurried, considered, and absolutely meant, "Eliza Calloway, I would very much like to ask your permission to court you properly." She laughed not at him but with him, with the delight of it, because the formality and the earnestness were so entirely, perfectly him. "You have my permission," she said. "You have had it for some time, I think." "I wanted to ask properly," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." The word love sat in the air between them very openly, very simply, with nothing around it to make it smaller or hedge it or protect either of them from what it meant. She had said it without quite planning to, and she did not take it back. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, briefly, with that same quiet tenderness she had first felt the day he kissed her outside the schoolhouse. "I love you," he said, plainly, without flourish, as though it were a fact he had established some time ago and was simply now reporting accurately. "I know," she said softly. "I love you too." Spring came to Dusty Creek the way Texas springs always came, suddenly, exuberantly, with an excess of wildflowers that turned the fields outside of town into something verging on the spectacular. The school year continued with increased enrollment. 4 new families had moved into the county over the winter, adding 8 more students to Eliza's classroom, and she was seriously considering writing to the county superintendent to request an assistant. Cole proposed on a Tuesday evening in April. He had come to Me's boarding house in his good jacket and asked Eliza if she would walk with him to the small rise east of town, where the bluebonnets had come in thick and blue under the late afternoon sky. She wore a yellow dress that she had bought from the Henley sisters, and the sun was warm, and they walked out through the edge of town along the road that led to his ranch and turned off up the rise, and the view from the top was everything the land around Dusty Creek was at its best, wide and golden and honest. The town spread below them with its smoke and its noise, and beyond it the open country running to the horizon. He had not brought flowers or a speech. He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band set with a small garnet that glowed red-brown in the afternoon sun, and she recognized immediately that it had not been bought at the general store because Hector Vance did not carry anything like it. "My mother's," he said, answering the question before she asked it. "I have carried it a long time. I thought I would carry it forever without knowing what to do with it." He looked at her. "Eliza, I was lonely before you came. I do not mean simply alone. I have been alone plenty of times and managed it well enough. I mean lonely in the way that a person forgets what the sound of their own name feels like in someone else's mouth, because it has been too long since anyone said it with any warmth. You gave me that back. You gave me a great deal back that I had stopped expecting to have." He paused. "Will you marry me? Will you come and live in my house and fill it up with all the things that make it a home? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" She was crying before he finished, which surprised her because she had not expected to cry. She had expected to be calm and certain, and she was certain, but the certainty was so enormous and so full that it spilled over. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Cole, of course yes. You already deserve me, you have for a long time." He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, which felt like the universe making a quiet but pointed comment. He kissed her on the top of the bluebonnet-covered rise with the whole town below them and the sky above them and the spring air warm and sweet, and she thought, "This is what I came west for. Not the schoolhouse, not the adventure, not the escape from a life that had grown too small. I came for this exactly, even though I did not know it when I started." Me cried when they told her. She denied it vigorously and attributed the moisture in her eyes to the onion she had been cutting in the kitchen, despite the fact that there was no onion in evidence anywhere in the room, and Eliza and Cole exchanged a glance of shared delight that felt like its own small private language. Hector Vance told everyone in the store within the next 48 hours, so the announcement was essentially made for them. They were married in June, in the church where they had first truly noticed each other, with Reverend Clark presiding, and what appeared to be the entire population of Dusty Creek in attendance. Eliza wore a white dress that the Henley sisters had made with breathtaking speed and considerable skill, and Cole wore a suit that had clearly been acquired for the occasion, and which he wore with the same quiet ease. He wore everything adapted to himself rather than himself adapted to it. Me sat in the front row with her handkerchief at the ready, and used it extensively. The children from the school sat in a solid block in the middle rows, and behaved, collectively, far better than anyone had a right to expect. Sheriff Walcott, arriving late, slid into the back row during the vows and later told his deputy that he had something in his eye, a statement the deputy accepted with the professional neutrality it deserved. Cole looked at her throughout the ceremony with an expression that was entirely, openly, unguardedly full, the face of a man who has learned to keep things inside for so long that when he finally lets something out it comes with the force of everything that had been held back. She held his hands in front of the congregation and said her vows with a steady voice and a wildly unsteady heart, and when Reverend Clark said the words that made them officially and permanently bound to each other, Cole pressed her hands gently and said her name the way he always said it, quietly, completely, as though it were something worth saying carefully. She moved into his house that June, and she did, as she had promised, furnish it. Not extravagantly. There was no extravagance available in a frontier town in 1878, but with the particular intentionality of someone who understood what a home was for. She hung curtains in the two main windows. She put a tablecloth on the kitchen table. She brought the small painting she had carried from Cincinnati, a quiet landscape of nothing particularly dramatic, just green hills and light, and hung it on the wall of the main room where it changed the feeling of the whole space in a way that she knew Cole noticed because he stood and looked at it for a long moment after she put it up. She kept Gerald's portrait on her desk in the school, and she put Cole's parents' photograph on a shelf in the main room where it was visible from the kitchen table, surrounded by a few small things they accumulated together over the first months. A piece of pale quartz Cole had found in the east field, a small carved wooden bird that Clem Dawson had made for her at Christmas, a pressed bluebonnet from the rise where Cole had proposed. Cole, for his part, did what he had always done: fix things, built things, made things work. But he did them differently now. He still rose before sunrise to check the cattle, still worked with the focused efficiency that was his nature, but he came back to the house at midday and she was there, and in the evenings they sat on the porch in the blue hour of the Texas dusk and talked the way people talk when they have each other's full attention and intend to keep it. She began to know him in the deeper layers. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes. Not often, but occasionally, the remnant of things he had seen in his ranger years that he did not talk about directly but which left traces. She learned to recognize the particular quietness that meant he was troubled versus the quietness that meant he was simply content, and they were genuinely different qualities of silence. She learned that he had a dry and unexpected humor that emerged at unpredictable moments, delivered with such a straight face that it took her a half-second to catch it, and that catching it was one of her particular private joys. She learned that he sang quietly, tunelessly, unconsciously, when he was doing repetitive work, old ballads and hymns and folk songs that she recognized sometimes and sometimes did not. He learned her too. He learned that she talked through problems out loud and needed someone to listen rather than immediately provide solutions, a distinction he had not previously considered, but adapted to with his customary thoughtfulness. He learned that she had a particular laugh for when something was genuinely funny that was different from her polite laugh, and he hoarded the genuine laugh like a specific treasure. He learned that she grieved her uncle in small, quiet ways, pausing sometimes in the middle of teaching to think of something Gerald would have said about a particular child's progress, and that the best thing he could do in those moments was simply be present. They learned each other, slowly and with great attention, the way people learn a new language, making occasional errors, correcting themselves, gradually becoming fluent in each other. The summer passed. The school year began again in September with even more students, and this time the county superintendent had agreed to send an assistant, a nervous young man from Austin named Mr. Theo Park, who arrived with an enormous amount of enthusiasm and not quite enough practical experience, but proved, under Eliza's guidance, to be a genuinely good teacher with the children. The school was becoming a real institution, which made her feel something she could only describe as rightful pride. She discovered she was expecting their first child in November of 1879, and she told Cole on a quiet evening when they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them, and she said it simply and directly because that was the way she had learned to say things to him without cushion or preamble, because he received truth best plainly. He went very still for a moment. Then a smile broke across his face, slow and sunrise-wide, and he stood up from the table and came around to her, and held her face in his hands the way he had the first time he kissed her. "Eliza," he said, and could not apparently finish the sentence, and she laughed and he laughed too, and there was no need for any more words than that. Doc Ambrose pronounced her healthy and the pregnancy normal, and told them both to rest and not worry, advice that Eliza followed regarding the worrying and largely ignored regarding the resting, because she had 36 students and a school to run and a December pageant to organize, and she was not going to let a baby she hadn't met yet stop her from doing any of it. Cole, predictably, concerned himself with every practical element of the child's arrival, with the thoroughness he brought to any important project. He built a cradle in the barn during the winter evenings, working by lantern light after the day's work was done, with a care and precision that made it, when it was finally finished and he brought it into the house, genuinely beautiful in the plain and functional way of things made by a person who cares deeply about what they are making. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "Cole," she said. "It is not fancy," he said from behind her. "It is perfect," she said. She turned around. "You made it with your hands." "I make most things with my hands," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I mean." Their son was born in June of 1880, on a summer morning that arrived gold and clear through the curtained windows of their house, delivered by Doc Ambrose, with me Hutchins providing a running commentary of encouragement and criticism in equal measure that Cole, pacing the porch outside, could hear through the walls, and which he found somehow more comforting than silence. They named him Gerald James Merritt, Gerald for her uncle, James for Cole's father. Cole held his son for the first time in the afternoon, sitting in the chair by the window with the gold light on them both, and Eliza watched from the bed with the particular exhaustion and fullness of a woman who has just done the most extraordinary thing she will ever do, and she watched her husband hold this tiny person with the same careful precision he brought to everything fragile and important, and she thought, "There is nothing lonely in this house anymore. There has not been for a long time. And there will not be again." Gerald James Merritt was, from his earliest days, loudly enthusiastic about everything, which surprised them both because his father was the quietest person either of them had ever known. He was interested in everything: the horses, the cattle, the chickens, the dirt, the sky, the insects. He followed Cole around the yard at 2 years old with the dedicated focus of a person who has decided that this specific adult is the source of all knowledge in the known world. And Cole, for his part, explained everything patiently and thoroughly, as though the child were a small ranching partner whose understanding genuinely mattered. It was me Hutchins who pointed out, one afternoon when she had come to visit and was watching Cole and the 2-year-old Gerald attempting together to fix a fence post, that she had never in her years in Dusty Creek seen Cole Merritt look the way he looked right now. "What way is that?" Eliza said from beside her. "Like someone who knows exactly where he is," me said, "and is glad of it." Eliza watched her husband and her son in the afternoon light, Cole crouching down to the boy's level to show him how the post fit into the ground, Gerald's small face serious with the effort of understanding. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly it." The school continued to grow. By 1881, Eliza had 44 students, 2 assistant teachers including the now much improved Mr. Park, and a genuine curriculum that the county superintendent held up as a model for other frontier schools. A fact that she considered enormously satisfying and used as leverage to request a new set of geography maps and 3 cases of arithmetic primers, which were duly provided. She argued at the town council publicly now, because things had shifted in Dusty Creek sufficiently that a woman making a formal presentation to the council no longer required a council member to technically present it on her behalf. Though Cole continued to attend every meeting and vote with a reliability she had long since stopped finding surprising. He was still the man who said 3 sentences when others said 30, and accomplished more by those 3 sentences than most people accomplished by the 30. They argued sometimes, as people who care deeply about things and live in close proximity inevitably do. She was a person with strong convictions about education and justice and the proper arrangement of domestic space, and he was a person with strong convictions about land management, practicality, and the advisability of not taking on more cattle than the land could support. These convictions occasionally came into direct conflict, particularly when she wanted to use money he had earmarked for a new section of fencing, to purchase the complete set of McGuffey readers she had been coveting for the school library. The fence argument lasted 3 days and resulted in a compromise that satisfied them both moderately, which she had come to understand was the best achievable outcome in any genuinely contested disagreement between 2 people who are both right about different things simultaneously. He never raised his voice during the arguments. Neither did she. They were both people who expressed intensity through precision rather than volume, and their arguments had a quality of focused, earnest debate that occasionally made me, when she witnessed them, want to award points to both sides. The West was changing around them, as it had been changing throughout the decade and would continue to change. The cattle drives that had brought economic life to towns like Dusty Creek were beginning to shift as the railroads pushed further and further through the territory, bringing with them the particular transformation of the frontier that arrived in the wake of steel tracks and the assumption of the Eastern market. Cole watched these changes with the same careful attention he gave to everything and began, in 1882, to diversify the ranch, less pure cattle, more mixed farming, a small apple orchard on the southern slope of his land that he planted with the long view thinking of a man who understands that trees take years to produce fruit, and the investment is therefore about faith rather than profit. She loved the orchard idea unreservedly, which pleased him. She planted things alongside the trees, flowers and herbs along the orchard edge, a proper kitchen garden that expanded every spring as she became more skilled at managing it. The house that had been spare and camp-like when she first saw it in January of 1879 was, by 1882, entirely and undeniably a home, not crowded or cluttered, but full, in the specific way of places where people have been happy in them consistently over time. They went to the Christmas dance in December of 1882 as they had gone every year since they were married, which was Dusty Creek's major social occasion, and which Cole endured with good humor, and she attended with genuine delight, because she loved to dance and he had, over 3 years of patient practice, become entirely competent at it. He was a careful dancer, as he was careful at most things, attentive to her movement, economical in his own, not showy but wholly reliable, which was in her assessment considerably better than showy. She danced with him in the crowded hall while the fiddle played and the candles burned, and the children ran between the feet of the adults in the uncontrollable way of children who have been kept still all day, and she looked up at him mid-dance and found him already looking at her with that expression she had loved from the first time she saw it, steady and warm and entirely meant. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "You," he said. Simply, directly, as though it were perfectly obvious, which apparently it was. "Specifically," she said. "Specifically," he said, and then he was quiet for a moment as they turned through the music. "I am thinking that I am the luckiest man in this room and possibly in the county and quite possibly in the state of Texas, and I am thinking that I do not say that often enough." She smiled so widely it reached her eyes. "You say it enough," she said. "You say it every time you fix something without being asked, or build something with your hands because you thought of a thing we needed before I knew we needed it, or look at me across a room in a way that makes everyone in between us feel slightly invisible. You say it all the time. You just say it without words." He turned her through the music and looked at her with that slow, certain smile. "You understand me better than I understand myself," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "You do not mind." "I do not mind at all," he said. In the spring of 1883, Clem Dawson, who was now 14 years old and had gone from a boy who could not write his own name to one of the best readers in the school, a transformation that Eliza considered one of her most significant professional achievements, came to her after school one day with a composition he had written. He handed it to her with the careful solemnity of someone presenting something they are both proud of and afraid about, and she read it standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with the spring afternoon behind her. It was a story about a town, and the people in it rough, unpracticed in its construction but vivid and honest in its observation. In it, he had written about a teacher who arrived on a stagecoach and a rancher who helped her with her bags and built a school roof and sat on the town council and said 3 sentences that changed things, and the way the town felt different once both of them were in it, warmer somehow, more like itself. She looked up from the paper. Clem was watching her with careful eyes. "This is very good, Clem," she said. "I wanted to write about something real," he said. My pa says you write best about real things." "Your father is absolutely correct," she said. "This is the best thing you have written and I want you to keep writing. Promise me." He promised. She kept that composition in the drawer of her desk beside Gerald's portrait for the rest of her years in Dusty Creek, and she showed it to Cole that evening, and he read it standing at the kitchen table with Gerald the toddler attempting to climb his leg. And when he finished reading, he looked at Eliza with an expression that was entirely open and slightly vulnerable. "He got it right," Cole said quietly. "He did," she said. "The part about the town feeling warmer," he said. "That was you. That was not me." "It was both of us," she said. "That is rather the whole point." Their second child arrived in the summer of 1884, a girl this time, with Eliza's dark hair and Cole's amber eyes, a combination that struck everyone who saw her as somewhat miraculous. They named her Clara Mee, the second name a tribute that sent Mee Hutchins directly to her handkerchief, for the longest recorded duration anyone had ever witnessed, including Mee's own wedding. Cole held Clara on the porch in the early evening of the day she was born, while Gerald, now 4 years old and tremendously interested in the new development, sat beside his father examining the baby with the scientific curiosity of someone who has been told this is his sister and is still working out the implications. "She is very small," Gerald said. "You were this small," Cole said. Gerald considered this with appropriate skepticism. "I was not this small." "You were exactly this small," Cole said. "I held you just like this." Gerald looked up at his father and then at the baby and then back at his father. "And you did not drop me." "Not once," Cole said. "Good," Gerald said, apparently satisfied. He leaned against Cole's arm with the easy certainty of a child who has never once doubted that the arm will hold him, and looked out at the evening fields. Eliza watched from the doorway, with Doc Ambrose's specific instructions to rest being ignored in favor of this particular view, and she thought that this was the image she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The three of them on the porch in the fading light, the man who had picked up her bags without being asked now holding her daughter with the same unconscious care, the boy who had arrived in the world loud and remained loudly curious leaning against his father's side, the fields going golden in the dusk. She stepped out onto the porch and sat in the other chair, and Cole glanced at her. "Doc said rest," he said. "I am resting," she said. "I am sitting down." He gave her the look that was his version of exasperation, mild, fond, entirely resigned to the impossibility of getting her to do something she had decided not to do. She gave him back the look that was her version of cheerful obstinacy. "You are exactly as impossible as you were in September of 1878, he said. "I am absolutely more impossible," she said. "I have had 6 years of practice." He smiled. Gerald turned to look at his mother and then back at his father and said, with the particular insight of small children who absorb more than adults realize, "You look happy." Pa. Cole looked at his son, then at the baby in his arms, then at Eliza. The amber eyes were warm and full and entirely unguarded. "I am," he said. "I am very happy." Dusty Creek continued to grow and change around them, as towns do when they are on the right side of history and geography simultaneously. The railroad came through the county in 1885, not directly through Dusty Creek, but close enough that it changed the economics of the region in ways that Cole had been preparing for since 1882, which meant that when other ranchers in the area found themselves scrambling to adapt, the Merritt Ranch adapted smoothly and without crisis. The apple orchard produced its first real harvest that same year, and Eliza sold the surplus to the hotel and the general store, and used the money to purchase the complete set of McGuffey readers she had been denied in the fence argument 3 years previously, a victory she accepted with gracious restraint. Hector Vance retired and sold the general store to a young couple from Louisiana, and Mee Hutchins announced that she was considering retiring from the boarding house, a statement she had made approximately once a year for the past 6 years, and which no one took entirely seriously, though Cole quietly repaired the boarding house porch and the 2 windows that had been drafty all winter, because me was not going to ask anyone to do it and it needed doing. Eliza noticed this. She always noticed. Sheriff Walcott finally, in 1886, admitted that the thing that had been in his eye at their wedding had been, in fact, a tear, which admission he made with an air of extreme dignity that suggested he considered the confession a matter of public record to be taken seriously and never mentioned again. Cole, who had maintained for 8 years that he had suspected as much, said nothing, which Eliza considered an act of profound generosity. The town had given the Merritt family something that Eliza, arriving off a stagecoach in the blazing dust of 1878, could never have anticipated: belonging. The layered, specific, irreplaceable belonging of a place that has watched you grow and has grown with you, that carries the record of your particular life in its streets and its buildings and its people. The schoolhouse that bore the marks of Gerald Calloway's vision and her own 8 years of teaching. The boarding house where me had arranged a dinner with pot roast and magnificent intentions. The church porch where she had first stood beside a man with amber eyes and asked his name. The rise with the bluebonnets where he had proposed. The hotel restaurant with the tablecloths and Don Augustin's dignified welcome. The road that ran east to the ranch, where everything that mattered to her lived. She stood in the schoolhouse on a September morning in 1886, looking out at 47 children in various states of academic readiness, with Mr. Park at the far end of the room working through arithmetic with the older students, and the September sun coming through the windows at the angle that turned the dust motes to gold. And she thought of Gerald Calloway's barely legible letter describing this room, and his need for someone who would not set it on fire. She thought, I did not set it on fire, I built it into something. She thought, so did he. She thought, we built it together, this life, this place, this improbable and entirely perfect thing, out of a stagecoach and a dropped bag and a man who crossed the street because it was simply the right thing to do. Cole came to meet her after school that afternoon, which he did sometimes when the work on the ranch permitted, rode into town, and walked back with her along the road in the long light. Gerald on Beauregard's back with the confidence of a child who has been on horseback since before he had proper memories of it. Clara in the carrier on Cole's chest with her eyes very wide and interested in the world, the way she always was. They walked the familiar road in the gold September afternoon and talked about ordinary things, the harvest, the children's progress, whether the window in the east bedroom needed to be replaced before winter, what me had said at Sunday supper about the new family in the county. The talk of a life thoroughly, happily shared. The talk of people who have long since stopped performing for each other and are simply, comfortably, entirely themselves. Gerald, from his perch on Beauregard, suddenly pointed at something in the field beside the road. "Papa," he said, "look, the bluebonnets came back early." Cole looked where the boy pointed. There was, indeed, a late-season scatter of bluebonnets in the dry grass of the field, unusual for September, a remnant of the unusually wet summer they had had. He looked at Eliza. She was already looking at him. "The rise," she said. "The rise," he confirmed. Gerald looked between his parents with the expression of someone who suspects he is adjacent to an important story he has not been told yet. "What is the rise?" he said. "A place," Cole said. "You have been there. You were just not old enough to remember." "What happened there?" Gerald said. Cole and Eliza looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when they are both thinking the same thing and neither of them needs to say it. "Your father asked me a very important question," Eliza said, "and I said yes, and that was the beginning of everything." Gerald considered this. "What question?" "You will understand when you are older," Cole said, which was what adults said when they did not want to explain something, but Gerald Merritt was his mother's son as well as his father's, and he narrowed his eyes with the particular skepticism of a child who does not accept that answer but knows from experience that pressing it further was unlikely to produce results. "Was it about cattle?" he said. It was not about cattle, Cole said. Was it about the school? No. Was it Gerald? Eliza said. Yes, Mama. Look at the bluebonnets and be quiet for a moment. He looked at the bluebonnets. He was briefly quiet. Cole reached across and took her hand as they walked, the way he had been reaching across and taking her hand for 8 years, with the same simple certainty that it was his to take and her gift to give. Clara made a small, content sound from her carrier and reached a tiny fist toward the moving shadow of a passing bird. The road ran ahead of them toward the ranch and the house and the life they had built out of an afternoon on a dusty street, and a man who had picked up a heavy bag without being asked, and a woman who had said thank you and meant it. And from those simplest of beginnings had come everything. The ring and the wedding and the children and the orchard and the school, and the years of evenings on the porch in the Texas dusk, and the arguments about fences and books, and all the accumulated ordinary, extraordinary days of a life lived together. She had come off that stagecoach alone and frightened, and pretending very hard that she was neither. She had carried her uncle's death and her own uncertainty, and the weight of starting over in a place where nothing was familiar and everything was loud and dusty and entirely unknown. And a man had crossed the street, without being asked, and picked up the heaviest bag. And she had, without knowing she was doing it, picked up his. The evening light was long and gold on the road ahead of them. Gerald rode Beauregard with his small back straight and his eyes forward, already learning to look at land the way his father looked at it, with patience and attention, and the respect that a person gives to something that will outlast them. Clara made another sound, interested and alert, watching everything. Cole's hand was warm in hers, familiar and solid and entirely, permanently home. "Cole," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you crossed that street." He looked at her sidelong with the smile that she had been collecting for 8 years, the one that started slow and reached everything. "I am very glad you dropped your bags," he said. She laughed genuinely, the real laugh he had learned to hoard like treasure, and it rose into the September air and scattered like bluebonnet seeds in the late afternoon wind, and the road ran on ahead of them, gold and clear and entirely known, all the way home.